In the previous lesson, we talked about the basic brush settings to get started with painting. In this lesson, we'll talk more about different brushes and how to create new ones. You can see on the 3D workspace that we have a few of different tools like Draw, Soften, Smear, Clone, Fill, Mask, and Annotate. Let's focus on the drawing brushes for a bit. The default drawing brush is called Text Draw, and you can rename it or create your own brush. Let's copy this brush and name it green and change its color. And now, let's create another brush by clicking Add Brush and name it yellow. Set the color. And now we have three brushes, so one default, green and yellow. It's important to remember that for each created brush, all the options below it will be saved and we'll be able to use them later, so it's good to have a default brush just in case. Let's select the yellow brush and change its size. There's one catch, this little icon next to pen sensitivity options. If it's turned on, the option will be shared across all the brushes. It is turned on for radius by default, so let's change the radius of the yellow brush to 30 pixels and strength to 0.5 and switch to green. Now let's change the size to 50 and strength to 0 and switch to the yellow brush again. As you can see, the size is the same as in the green brush, but the strength haven't changed because the strength is not shared across the brushes. For both of these brushes, we can change all the things that are below. For the presentation purposes, we'll make a Melvin stamp brush, so we'll create a new one from the default, white one, and set the name for this brush to Melvin Stamp. Now, let's head to the Texture tab below and click New. So now we created a slot for our texture, but to actually add it, we need to go to the Texture properties and we see that at the top, if we click on the brush, we have the brush and brush mask textures, and we'll talk about it in a bit. For now, let's leave it as connected to the brush and load our Melvin texture. The type of the texture is set to image or movie, so that's exactly what we want. Let's click Open and search for the texture. Now let's paint, and you probably noticed that it's not a stamp for now, but just continuous Melvins everywhere. Colors are alright because our brush was white, but we need to do something about the mapping of the texture. We need to go back to the tool settings at the top, and we see our texture, and below that, mapping drop down. There are a few different mapping types, and by default, the mapping is set to view plane and it just follows the brush stroke. We can see some more options here. Tiled will just tile our texture depending on the brush size, so bigger brush will tile bigger texture, and smaller brush will tile the smaller texture. 3D option applies the texture like it had the generated coordinate, so as you can see, it puts the texture on the top and bottom. Random will just randomly distribute the texture, which is useful for grunge or dirt textures. For a brush like stamp, the best option would be to choose the stencil option, and let's see what happens. Now, when we have our cursor in the 3D or 2D viewport, we can see a stencil of Melvin, and we can move it by pressing right-click and drag, scale it by pressing Shift, right-click and drag, and rotate with Ctrl, right-click and drag. Let's position it on the center of one of the faces. And we have Melvin stamped onto the cube. I will quickly change the fall off to sphere to see Melvin a little bit better for the next examples. Now let's switch the mapping to viewplane again and explain a few more options. We can also stamp our texture by using this mapping type, but we need to change the stroke settings because for now, it's a continuous stroke and we want the textures to be stamped with some distance between. If we change the stroke method to space and spacing to something above 100, we see that Melvin no longer overlaps himself. Now all of them are rotated the same, so first let's reset the angle to the default value, and then we can turn on Rake under the mapping and the rotation will follow the stroke. Very useful for painting seams. Let's turn off the rake and see what random option does. Random option will add a little bit of variation to the rotation. Let's set it to 50 and we can see some rotation. We can also change offset and size of the texture, so let's experiment a bit. With the offset, the texture is translated, and with size, it's just resized. Let's change the offset back to 0 and size to 2. If you want texture to be smaller, we need to set a higher value in the size settings. And if we want our texture to not repeat but be clipped, we need to go back to the texture properties and change the extension in the mapping tab, and our texture is clipped. Let's bring the default settings for extension back and go to the tool options again. Reset the texture size to 1, set the constant falloff, and see the rest of the strokes methods. Dots option is similar to space, but it depends on the velocity of the brush. If we go fast, it repeats less, and if we go slow, it repeats more. Drag dot just allows to click, drag the stroke, and when we let go, it accepts and places the texture on the face. Airbrush will behave like an airbrush, just spraying the texture. If we go slower, it will spray more, and if we go faster, it will leave some gaps. Let's turn the strength down to 0.2. The longer you stay in place, the more coverage you get. And we can set the strength back to 1. Anchored is another way of placing stickers, decals, or logos. We need to click and drag a mouse from a center of the location we want to put our texture and scale it as we want. The line stroke allows to paint the stroke following the straight line. With curve method, we can draw a curve and then the stroke will follow. So let's draw the curve now with Ctrl right click and drag, and Ctrl right click to create a sharp point. After pressing Enter, we see the texture applied to the curve. And the curve is aligned to the viewport, so we can rotate the view and put it somewhere else. If we want to delete the curve, we need to click the X button next to the curve name. In most of the stroke methods, we can also use stabilized stroke, which works like a lazy mouse and allows us to be more precise while painting. We'll be using the space stroke method most of the time, so let's change it and reset the stroke values to the default ones and turn off the stabilized stroke. To keep our brushes organized, we can set a custom icon for our brush by clicking a custom icon next to the brush thumbnail, and in our case, set Melvin as an icon. Now, let's focus on the brush mask option. Till now, we use just the texture, but maybe we want to have only the colored silhouette of our texture. For this, we'll duplicate our Melvin stamp brush and change the name to Melvin Mask. Now, we still have the Melvin texture, so we need to delete it below, and instead of texture, we'll go to the Texture Mask tab. and the process will be similar. We need to click New, go to the Texture Properties, and switch the brush to Brush Mask Texture. I will use the same texture, so I will just click Next to the new texture and find Melvin Stamp Texture. We can change the alpha to calculate in the Alpha tab and fine-tune the transitions in the texture. We will go to the Colors drop-down below and find the color ramp. By dragging the black value to the right, we see that now it takes the pixels value to create a black and white image. If you want to have a nice silhouette texture, we need to drag the white value to the left to, let's say, 0.15 and change the interpolation to constant. Now we have a nice mask and we can go to the tool properties and choose whatever color we want and use our masked texture. I'm sure you will need some kind of the dirt texture too, and instead of image textures, we can use procedural ones. Let's go back to the first brush we created, the most default one of them all, and copy it. It's always good to have one unchanged copy of the brush. So let's name our new brush Dirt. We can set the color to dark brown, and we'll use Texture Mask again. This time, we'll create a new texture mask and name it Dirt Mask. Then we'll go to the texture settings again, and instead of choosing the image texture, we'll choose clouds. And we can see that it is already working, but we might want to decrease the contrast to make it more dust-like. So again, we can use the color ramp below in the Colors tab. I want more smooth transitions, so I will use the B-spline interpolation method and set the white value to 0.8 and black to 0.5. Now we can add some randomness to our brush by going back to the brush options, and under Rake, I will choose Random, and we have a nice brush to use for some imperfections. And remember that you can also customize the fall-off and other options if you want. And similar to the unused materials, the unused textures might disappear too, so be sure to check the shield icon. Before the next lesson, try to create a few brushes, for example charcoal or saddle dust, or whatever comes to your mind.